Many people today assume that Christianity and science are in conflict. However, historically, this is somewhat of a new view. This objection usually finds its ways into conversations about the Dark Ages and so on. Now, before setting into particular details about this, let's discuss some of the history of how we got to these ideas. People that usually use these types of objections will look to the likes of Hypatia, Bruno, and Galileo as proofs of Christians in the conflict of science, historically. However, historians are in opposition of such views. The famous proponents of this view were people like Edward Gibbon, William Draper, and Andrew White. That these all are people that came up in the Enlightenment era. And these people picked up on these myths from the Protestants after the Reformation. As these Protestants, as they were attempting to divide and get away from the Catholic understanding. And these Protestants that would argue against the Catholic Church, one of the main arguments they used against the Catholic Church is that the Catholic Church was this big, bad, evil institution, and that it was time for the Protestants to bring this new light to the new world. So the Protestants had this new purpose or identity that gave them this idea to go into the world and bring light into it, assuming some kind of time of Dark Ages. However, the Protestants really just made this up. It was not something that was necessarily accurate, and that's certainly not to say that the Catholics were perfect in their duration of their history. And myself, I'm a Protestant pastor, so I'm certainly not arguing as some kind of truthfulness of Catholicism. However, I think it is certainly true to say that the Protestants' myth that the Catholics are this big bad institution that need to be light needs to come away from it, and as they are in darkness, not only now but even in that era, I think is just wrong. The Catholic Church gave us all of these things today. Now, this gets us into a lot of the ideas of the Dark Ages. I'm reading a book right now called The Light Ages by a historian, Seb Falk. And I'm just into the inklings of it. But his ideas is that, look, we shouldn't even necessarily call it the Dark Ages anymore because it was the furthest thing from darkness. The Catholic Church was learning so much through astronomy, through math, and other forms of things that gave us our modern science today. So it's actually the opposite of the way that these guys like William Draper, Edward Gibbon, and Andrew White argued. It's the opposite, because they argued that science and religion were in conflict. And when they began this conflict, as they wrote in this Enlightenment era, they were arguing for, again, a myth that was made up by the Protestants and should not be accepted as a true historical thing. Then, and when you consider how these things went, they would use examples that we see our modern atheists use today. Examples such as Galileo, which I have covered before, but I can briefly discuss it in this context now. I'm going to leave out some details to make this a little bit of a shorter commentary. But the idea that when these fellows, Draper and Gibbon and so on, attempted to argue for this conflict thesis, that Christianity and science had always been in conflict since their origin, this idea they picked up from people like Galileo. And so Galileo was famously known to be the one that was persecuted for saying that the earth was no longer the center, and that we are the ones actually rotating around the sun rather than the other way around. The heliocentrism and geocentrism debate. And people would like to say that this is the reason why he was arrested. However, there's simply no evidence to believe that this is true. The reason that Galileo gets put into house arrest, oh, that's another thing. There's some people that think that Galileo was just merely killed, which is obviously wrong. Galileo was put under house arrest, but the interesting thing is Galileo was not put into house arrest because he was doing science. Galileo was put under house arrest for a very different reason. And it's complex, but in the shortest way that I can explain it, Galileo's troubles had nothing to do with his science. Galileo had already picked up from ideas of those like Copernicus. So people were already very accepting of the idea that the sun is the center of the solar system and the earth rotates around it. However, Galileo was asked to provide documentation on this new view and evidence for this new view by the modern pope of that day. And Galileo, instead of offering this evidence to the pope, he mocks the pope publicly. And this is a big no-no in those days. So Galileo is put under house arrest essentially for this reason. Now again, we can look at this story today and say this is still a silly reason to imprison someone or house arrest somebody, and that's absolutely true, but the point here is that it has absolutely nothing to do with him doing science. And that's the point here. Another famous one is obviously the Bruno case. We see, again, the same writers we're discussing here, Draper and so on, pick up on the myth of Bruno. And they tried to paint Bruno as this scientist who was just attempting to have these new insights on science, such as things like some of the Galileo Copernicus stuff, and suggesting that there could be life on other worlds and these kinds of things. But again, it couldn't be further from the truth. Bruno certainly was not a scientist. There's no reason to think that. It was simply something they made up. He was more of a mythicist, he just was not doing any kind of form of science. The way that he thought about the world would be comparable to that of Billy Carson or something of that sort. So that's the two main ones that we see these people pick up on in that time frame. And again, it's just completely fabricated, completely made up. But these writers use this myth. And that's what we see in our modern atheistic talking points today. But again, the major point that I'm getting at here is that this is not agreed on upon any historian, and that we should really be calling this era the Light Ages, as they gave us our current models and ideas of astronomy, math, and philosophy today. But thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe for more content like this, and let me know what you think down below.